let's start learning about the skull, and we're going to start part one, and I know, subpart one, yeah, it doesn't make any sense, just roll with it, okay? We're going to start with the cranium. The cranium is the top of the skull. This is the part that encases the brain. So the cranium is this top part. The other bones that make up the face are cleverly called the facial bones. Who'd have thunk it? So we're going to learn these bones first, and then in part two, we're going to learn the facial bones. All right, so the first thing we're going to learn are the bones, the names of the bone, and the names of the seams between them, which are called sutures. So the bone on the front is cleverly called the frontal bone. You have one of those, goes all the way across your forehead. You have two parietal bones, one on the right, one on the left. And in the back, you have an occipital bone. On the side of your head, you have a temporal bone. If you're thinking, wow, aren't those the names of the lobes of the brain? You're absolutely right. You have one frontal bone, one occipital bone, though, and you have two lobes of those. That's the difference. Let's see, we also have a little part of the sphenoid bone that we can see right there. And then the ethmoid bone right here is mostly just sits right behind your nose. And I'll show you another diagram where you can see that a little more clearly. Now, the lines between the bones, the coronal suture goes along the frontal bone between the frontal and the parietal bones. The squamous suture goes between the temporal bone and the parietal bones on either side. Between the occipital bone and the parietal bone is the lambdoid suture. Notice lambdoid. The reason that it is called the lambdoid suture is that it is shaped much like the letter lambda in Greek. That's lambda in Greek. And that's what it looks like, and so it's called the lambdoid suture. Let me erase that. There we go. And then let's go back to the pointer. There we go. In between the two parietal bones from the frontal bone to the occipital bone is the sagittal suture, which cleverly sits along the mid-sagittal plane. Ta-da! So those are the main bones and the sutures. No, we're not gonna, okay, never mind. Let's go back to that. Okay. I don't remember which one of these controls I want. Oops. Okay, let's go back to that. Okay, so this is what it looks like from the back. Sagittal suture comes down. The occipital bone and the parietal bone are connected like that. So this part is the lambdoid suture. This is the squamous suture here. Okay, and then you can see the vertebral column comes up and articulates with the bottom of the occipital bone. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the eye holes, what you think of as the eye holes, are called the orbits, and each orbit is made up of parts of 7 different bones. Any part of the bone that makes up part of the orbit, that part is called the orbital part of whatever bone. So this part here is the orbital part of the frontal bone. Okay, so when you're looking and trying to figure out where one bone ends and the next bone begins, look for the sutures. So the frontal bone comes down to here. There's a suture right there. The suture runs along here to there, goes along there. All of that part between this edge and that suture is the orbital part of the frontal bone. Likewise, this is an orbital part of the sphenoid bone. This is an orbital part of the zygomatic bone, which is this one that makes your little cheekbones. Okay. A process is something that sticks out from the main part of a thing, which is not the most technical description you've ever heard. I know, but we talked about cellular processes like cilia and flagella. Those are processes off of the cell. Bones also have processes, and they are named not necessarily for the bone that they're a process of, but for the bone that they're going to. All right, so think of it this way. This bone here is the zygomatic bone, okay? It has 3 processes, so we can't call any one of them the zygomatic process. because we wouldn't know whether we meant this one that goes to the frontal bone, or this one that connects with the maxilla bone, or this one that connects with the temporal bone. So we're going to call them by the bone that they connect with. So this process is the frontal process of the zygomatic bone. Okay, it's part of the zygomatic bone, so it's of the zygomatic bone. Okay, it is part of this bone, zygomatic. It's the frontal process because it's going to the frontal bone. Okay, this is a process that's part of the frontal bone. It's going to the zygomatic bone. So this is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. Practice that 20 times. Try naming some other processes, and it will make sense once you get it. You will get it eventually. Okay. Now, if we take a coronal section through the face, we are going to see sinuses, which are pockets inside the bones of the skull. Okay, we've talked about some other sinuses, which are pockets inside of other things. These are the sinuses of the skull, and they're named for the bone that they're part of. So we have frontal sinuses, which are in the frontal bone. We have ethmoidal sinuses, which are part of the ethmoid bone. And then we have these really big maxillary sinuses, which are part of the maxillae. These are all connected to the nasal cavity. And they are lined, all of them, even though you can't see the openings here. These are also connected to the nasal cavity, lined with a columnar epithelium with lots and lots of goblet cells, so they all have mucus. These are going to help with the process of warming the air that you breathe and creating sound. And you probably never think about your sinuses and wouldn't know you had them unless you've gotten a sinus infection, which hurts so bad because fluid builds up inside these cavities, literally inside the bone. And it hurts like heck because the pressure, then you feel like there's pressure pushing on your face. And yeah, it hurts a lot. So those are your sinuses. All right, now one other thing I want you to learn about are these things called fossae, the cranial fossae. A fossa is an indentation. So the cranial fossae are indentations in the cranium itself. And the cranium, remember, is the part of the skull that holds the brain. So we have 3 pairs of fossae, anterior, middle, and posterior. Notice this is middle and not median or medial. It is middle because it's between the front and the back. So the frontal lobe sits in the anterior fossa, the temporal lobe sits in this middle fossa, and then the cerebellum is cradled in this posterior fossa. And if we look at the cranium from the top, it looks like this. So here's the front of the cranium, here's the back. We have a bunch of holes that we will talk about in a minute, and you can see these fossae here, anterior, middle, and posterior fossae right there. So that's the end of that section. We will come back and talk about the markings that I want you to know on some of these big bones of the skull.